Evening ahead. Please start. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to each of you to what promises to be an insightful discussion titled Budget 2022, Sri Lanka's Path to Economic Stability. My name is Trishma Pinto. It's my pleasure to be your host here this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, as Sri Lanka approaches social and economic crossroads, the upcoming budget provides an opportunity for our nation to choose the road towards inclusive and dynamic growth. This evening, we've gathered here to discuss and debate the prospects and the possibilities of the national budget. And with the Budget 2022 presented to the Parliament next month, our discussion this evening will focus on finding ways to stabilize and strengthen the Sri Lankan economy. We're privileged that we are joined by an international expert as well as local experts today, and we trust that their insights will provide us all with a better understanding of how meaningful reforms can place our nation on a sustainable pathway towards progress. At the very outset, ladies and gentlemen, before we begin, it's my pleasure to let you all know that this evening's pre-budget discussion has been organized by NextGen SL in partnership with the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom. Before we commence our discussions today, allow me to introduce our two host institutions to you. We'll start first with NextGen SL. NextGen SL is Sri Lanka's only cross-party youth political initiative, which brings together young politicians and political activists across the spectrum. The co-conveners of the initiative are Rasika Jayakodi and Milinda Rajapaksa, two youth leaders within the main political camps. A number of young political figures in the main political parties work with NextGen SL in various capacities. The objective of this initiative is to drive positive youth engagement in politics and to foster a meaningful dialogue around the pressing issues concerning the country's future. Well, that was NextGen SL for you, and now let me take this opportunity to introduce to you the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom. The foundation was established in Germany in 1958 with the aim to promote the goal of making the principle of freedom valid for the dignity of all people and in all areas of society, both in Germany and abroad. The foundation's work is funded by the German Parliament through the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, the Foreign Office, and increasingly by the European Union. The foundation works in over 60 countries worldwide, and its association with Sri Lanka is 5 decades old, and it focuses on the core values of freedom and responsibility. That was the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom for you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, with that introduction of two of our host institutes for you, we are now delighted to officially commence our event this evening on Budget 2022. So to now do the honors of the official welcome address, please join me in inviting to the lectern the head of the Sri Lanka and Bangladesh office for the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands together for Mr. Wolfgang Heinze.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Dear representatives of government and opposition, distinguished experts, members of the diplomatic corps, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us today for this event, Budget 2022, Sri Lanka's Path to Economic Stability. I would first of all like to thank our partner NextGen SL for organizing this very timely event. We just had 2 weeks ago the appropriations bill kicked off by the government. There's going to be discussions in Parliament next month, and I think there's no better time for having this kind of an event. Now, when we look at the budget, a government's budget is not only about putting numbers on paper, deciding what kind of part of the government is going to get how much funds, and what kind of part of the country should get more support. I think when we look at the budget, it's really about values and vision. What kind of principles do you use when you allocate funds? What kind of ideas stand behind that? And when it comes to vision, it's really a question of what do you envision for the future of the country, of Sri Lanka, and of its people. So, we look at this as a budget for 2022, but I believe that it really goes far beyond 2022. It's about the future of Sri Lanka and its people. We, the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, would like to be a neutral discussion platform for all, to be able to voice their different opinions, concerns, and ideas. Because I believe that only in the open, frank, sometimes hard, frank, but free competition of ideas, do we find ways to move forwards? Do we find common grounds to move forwards and build a greater future? Now, I know that every country is different. Every situation is unique. But I believe that, more often than not, experiences can be shared and may be useful. That's why we as a foundation working in more than 60 countries have a lot of experts in many different parts of the world who are more than happy to support the process here in Sri Lanka. And for this today, we have my very dear colleague Justus Lenz join us from Berlin to talk about the German situation, because Germany also went through several upheavals, after the Second World War, losing the Second World War, fortunately. We were bombed back into the Stone Age. So when you look at pictures, from Germany in 1945, it's basically ruins. But we managed to overcome that through the social market economy. And, there's another big example on that, and that is the reunification of East and West Germany, where we really had to put together two very different countries and two very different systems. And that was also a lot of experience for us in moving out, especially on the eastern side, from a more socialist, communist economic system. So these are experiences that may be interesting, may be useful for here in Sri Lanka. But honestly, we really don't want only Germans to speak about Germany. These foreigners, they don't speak the language, they don't know the culture, they don't know the history. They really have no idea what they're talking about. So we really don't want to fall into that kind of a trap. Therefore, I'm really, really happy that we have experts here from Sri Lanka who will also put in their opinions, voice, their ideas, which is, I think the most important part of all this, the discussion. So I'd like to thank you all for joining today, the panelists, especially Professor Sirimal Abeyratne, Honorary Mayantha Disanayake, and of course the chairman of the board of investment, Sanyaya Monhotala. And then of course we have our dear moderator, Satya Karunaratna. And I apologize, I've just arrived a month ago, and I'm sure I got all names wrong in the pronunciation. So I hope today we'll find some points for thoughts that will really positively support the budget discussions, and that this will strengthen the part of Sri Lanka and its people moving forward on a path of prosperity and freedom. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wolfgang Heinze, for your very perceptive opening remarks, setting the stage for what is going to be a few interesting perspectives that we can expect over the course of this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, with the budget 2022 coming up, I'm sure we're all eager to gain insight into how to strengthen and grow the local economy. As we envision a national budget that assures economic prosperity for all Sri Lankans, are there experiences from other countries that Sri Lanka can learn from? Well, Germany certainly seems to have a great success story to share, and our keynote address this evening will highlight for us the pillars of Germany's economic success, and hopefully we will be able to take away some of those German strategies that may prove useful in a Sri Lankan context. Well, to share with us more details about the same, we have with us our keynote speaker today, joining us live online. He is Mr. Justus Lenz. Please allow me to introduce him to you officially. Mr. Lenz is head of the Liberal Institute and the Division of Issue Management and Political Consulting of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom. Before serving at the foundation, he has worked as head of fiscal policy and digital transformation at the German Family Business Association. He's also a visiting lecturer at the Willy Brandt School of Public Policy, University of Erfurt. With that introduction, ladies and gentlemen, may I now present before you virtually our keynote speaker this evening. Let's welcome Mr. Justus Lenz.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, warm greetings from Berlin. Let me first take this opportunity to thank you for the kind invitation. It is a great honor to speak at this occasion. I am very happy to share some experiences from Germany. Moreover, I am looking forward to our panel discussion. The focus of my talk will be the economic development of Germany and the role played by our market order, the so-called social market economy. The conclusion, after looking at more than 70 years of German economic history, is clear. Germany's economic success is based on free markets, property rights and unregulated prices, the rule of law, infrastructure and social policies, all provided by the state, abstention from direct market intervention, to be honest mostly, free trade and the EU's common market. These are the main pillars of the social market economy and provide the framework for all economic activities. Of course, and let me stress this, the actual economic growth depends entirely on entrepreneurs who develop products and services. But in order to drive development and progress, entrepreneurs need a well-functioning market order which provides freedom and security. So, let me explain the social market economy and its principles in more detail. To start, I will take you back to two key moments for Germany's economic development after the Second World War: the summer of 1948 and the autumn of 1989, more than 50 years later. Both dates mark the beginning and the end of an enormous real-life experiment. Secondly, let me talk about the results of this experiment and the principles of the social market economy. And thirdly, I will take a quick look at the role of free trade and the European Union's common market. So, to begin, let us all jump back to the summer of 1948, a few years after the Second World War. The provision of food and shelter still poses enormous problems. The economy is in shambles. Rationing and fixed prices are in place to try to mitigate shortages. All in all, the situation was dire. Nevertheless, the liberal conservative politician Ludwig Erhard believed in the power of free markets and the entrepreneurial spirit, and he implemented his ideas. The summer of 1948 saw the beginning of reforms which created the social market economy. Erhard abolished price controls and introduced a new stability-oriented currency. And the direct effects were astonishing. Suddenly, shop windows, which were empty before the reforms, overflowed with goods. The former price controls meant that prices had been too low, so owners could not sell their goods without losing money. In addition, trust in the stability of the currency was lacking. In the following years, further steps followed, such as the creation of antitrust laws and the first steps towards the European single market. I have to stress that this course was highly controversial at the time. There was very strong opposition against the transformation from a controlled economy to a free market society, and that the positive effects of the reforms took some time made it worse. But after the first success of filling shop windows and a hard winter, soon enough the economy started working again, and the opposition cooled down. So at the end, the recovery was so complete, so successful, that 10 years later, the biggest problem was actually the lack of workers. So therefore, in 1961, Germany started the first work immigration program. However, only the western part of Germany implemented these free market reforms. East Germany, under the influence of the Soviet Union, started its transition towards a planned economy. Prices, production goals, research, and all aspects of economic activity were centrally planned. And this is why I spoke about an enormous real-life experiment at the beginning of my talk. In 1948, we had two countries with very similar starting conditions. They shared a language, the same cultural background, the same history, the same level of education, and they, of course, also were in the same climate zone. Both also had the burden of destruction after the Second World War. There were some differences, for example, the aid of the US for West Germany, but nonetheless, the starting conditions were very, very similar. Facing these enormous difficulties after the Second World War, West Germany implemented the social market economy and placed its trust in free markets, the entrepreneurial spirit, and an open society, while East Germany bet on central planning and top-down control. And to be honest, in the first 10, maybe 20 years, the race to prosperity between the two parts of Germany seemed to be a very close one. But the long-term effects of both free and controlled markets then soon became obvious. So let us jump ahead again in time, 50 years ahead to 1989, to another very historic moment: the Berlin Wall falls. After sealing communist East Germany and its population off with minefields, walls, and death traps. The reunification of East and West Germany follows in 1990. There are, of course, many reasons for this development, but in my opinion, the single most important one was the economic failure of East Germany and its planned economy. East Germany was simply bankrupt. The substance of companies, their machines and buildings were in decay. Also, East Germany's products were not competitive on the world market. No one wanted to buy a Trabi, an East German car, once they could also buy a BMW. The people in East Germany were very dissatisfied with their failing economy and they demanded change. After the fall of the wall, the overall majority wanted a quick reunification with West Germany. And again, as in 1948, the direct first effects of introducing free market mechanisms were very positive. People could suddenly buy a variety of products, bananas for example, which were simply not available normally in former communist East Germany. However, another parallel to 1948 is that it took time until the power of freedom and free markets took hold for good. The transition from a fundamentally broken planned economy to a market society was very difficult. One of the negative side effects were, for example, high unemployment rates in the former East Germany. But if we jump another time ahead in time to 2021, these problems were solved. Germany just had a successful decade of economic growth and rising employment. So I would say that overall, the results of the real-world experiment of market versus planned economy are very conclusive. The planned economy failed, it went bankrupt, and it lost the support of its people, while the social market economy proved to be very successful in real life. Free markets, the rule of law, and the resulting freedom for entrepreneurs were the keys to Germany's economic success. So, a lesson that can be drawn from looking at our experience in Germany is that reforms towards the free market order can be very successful. If one pursues this direction, it is important to consider that this success can take time. The implementation time can be painful and long, as seen both after 1948 and 1989. And also, of course, there's no easy recipe for implementing a free market order such as the social market economy. So I can just point out to you that Germany profited tremendously from the social market economy. And coming to my last point, one important part of this success was and is free trade, and especially the European single market. Up to now, I only talked about the national economic framework. And to be honest, we do not have the time to take an in-depth look at international connections. But I wanted to stress that the openness for trade and the gradual elimination of all tariffs and non-tariff trade barriers within the European single market were very, very important. Competition is tough and some companies will fail. But overall, competition makes us better. And when looking today at the most successful companies in Germany, many of them are family businesses which grew to be large and also very large. I have to say that they became successful because of the constant competitive pressure to be better, even though I'm very sure at times it was painful. Coming to the end of my talk, let me quickly sum up. The social market economy combines important roles for both free markets and state action. Free markets, property rights, and unregulated prices form the foundation. The role of the state is the enforcement of the rule of law, as well as the provision of infrastructure, education, and social policies. At the same time, and this is very, very important, the state needs to abstain from intervening directly in the market. This is also very difficult. But it is very important because the tasks for state action are already very demanding. Think, for example, about the difficulties in organizing an education system or building and maintaining a road network. State actors do have enough to do with these tasks. Even more supervisory tasks and the control of single economic actions, such as setting prices for certain goods or organizing production itself, will end in failure. And lastly, but very, very important, free market reforms need some time before the positive effects are widely felt. So when one starts upon this road, it is very important to remember that it can take some time. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to our discussion.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, you can applaud. That was our keynote speaker right there, Mr. Justus Lenz. And we thank him for enriching us all with his profound insights, as well as sharing with all of us the keys to Germany's economic success. I'm sure that even though we are here in Sri Lanka, we have found great value in his analysis of Germany's robust economic development. Well, ladies and gentlemen, on that note, very thought-provoking, it's time now for us to take this evening's discussion forward. We now move on to a valuable part of our agenda today, which is our panel discussion. And as you can see right behind me, we'll now be setting the stage to bring on our renowned experts on the topic as they now have a collective conversation on the theme for today, which is Budget 2022, Sri Lanka's Path to Economic Stability. As we look forward to learning from the esteemed viewpoints of our experts, may I now introduce to you each of our panelists here this evening. One of our panelists will, of course, be our keynote speaker, Mr. Justus Lenz. He has already been introduced to you, so we warmly welcome Mr. Lenz to join in our discussion. Meanwhile, our local experts include, we start off with Professor Sirimal Aberatne, who is Professor of Economics at the University of Colombo. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Colombo, master's degree from the International Institute of Social Sciences in The Hague, and a PhD from the Free University of Amsterdam. With that introduction of our first panelist, I'd like to invite Professor Sirimal to take his place. Ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands together as we welcome Professor Sirimal Aberatne. Our second panelist is Honorable Mayantha Dissanayake, who represents the opposition and has been a member of Parliament since 2015. He currently heads the youth movement of the main opposition party, Samagi Jana Balavege. Ladies and gentlemen, let's now welcome Honorable Mayantha Dissanayake. And our fourth panelist is Mr. Sanjay Mohottala, who is the chairman of the Board of Investment of Sri Lanka. In addition to this role, he's also a board member of the Sri Lanka Export Development Board and Sri Lankan Airlines, as well as a member of the Presidential Task Force for Economic Revival and Poverty Alleviation. He has also been a managing director and partner at the Boston Consulting Group. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Mr. Sanjay Mohottala. And now, ladies and gentlemen, let me also introduce to you our moderator for this discussion. She is a policy research analyst at the Advocata Institute. Let's put our hands together for Satya Karnaratne. And with all of our panelists and our moderator now on stage, I do hope we're all set for an engaging conversation on Budget 2022, Sri Lanka's Path to Economic Stability. Satya, the floor is yours.
Welcome to the Pre-22 Budget Forum organized by the Frederick Naumann Foundation. I think we all know Sri Lanka's economy is in a rather precarious condition at the moment. So the upcoming budget is quite crucial in terms of addressing these many issues. So we are glad to welcome all of you here today. Without further ado, I'd like to address my first question to Professor Sirimal Aberatne. So we know that it's quite obvious that the average people have had to endure quite grim realities these few days, and unfortunately we have to admit that. So I think recently, with the government having to reverse their policy on price controls, prices on cement, milk powder, gas and wheat flour have indeed increased. So my question to you is, how do you view this, and what proposals do you think the 2022 budget can implement in order to address this very severe issue?
Thank you, Sanjay. How long do you expect me to
So you have 5 minutes to answer your question, but you can go a little longer than that, I hope.
I don't know why it took so long for Sri Lanka to realize that price controls never work for a country. And it has never worked even for this country. We have a long history of price controls. administered prices, and it has done a lot of adverse things in this economy, and it has never sought out our supply shortages, but it has eliminated the quality goods from the market, and it has created black market for quality goods, and it has not helped in any way to eliminate poverty in this country. So that in fact, but it's a feel good policy, so the politically correct feel good policy. Other than that, it has done little in this country in sorting out, solving our basic economic problems related to poverty and commodity shortages. So I don't think it has worked, and I don't think it is going to work in the future. And just now we listened to the German experience, and market prices was one of the fundamental points that just as Les mentioned there. So now you might think that, okay, eliminating price controls is a good thing that we have done, and so that we can feel good about it. No, I don't say that either. The reason is, if you select things in an ad hoc and piecemeal manner, it's not going to work either. If it had come as part of an overall reform package, I would have been happier. Because it didn't come in that way, obviously the negative implications of this removal of price controls, as we right now experience it in the same way, is going to be enormous, particularly for the low-income groups.
Thank you so much, Professor Sirimala Aberatna. That was a very insightful answer. I'd like to move on to Mr. Sanjay Mohotala. So according to the World Investment Report by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, it has been stated that global foreign direct investment flows has fallen about 40% in the year 2020. And the report also says that there is room for this to improve in the year 2022. However, the prospects are quite uncertain. So given this context, how do you think the upcoming budget can accommodate the attraction of foreign direct inflows into the country?
Right. I think good questions up there. I think the way I would look at it is, first let's look at the foreign direct investment pool. Here's the report at the beginning of the year was talking about some level of resurgence, but of course with the COVID pandemic being lingering for some time than what was anticipated, many think that it would not rebound to 2019 levels and probably remain around 2010 levels. Now that is just the FDI pool, but the pool is big enough for us to fight. Then the second question comes in, how does the FDI flow into a country? Because there's a pool and we are not the only person on the beach, as we say, right? So then the question is, the way that the FDI typically flow is governed by what type of a size of a market that FDI goes in, because that is to cater to the local market. So India will get a lot of FDI because you have 1.3 billion people to feed to, so a car company will come and put up a car plant in India to do that. And so would be when Pakistan has 220 million. Sri Lanka, you have 20 million, they would not come for a car company. Second part of it is velocity. Velocity means the industry ecosystem has been very vibrant so that all the other industries keep on coming in because it's an ecosystem effect. Vietnam gets ecosystem effect because if you take electronics, all the component manufacturers are there, so people keep on coming in. So we have the same impact in apparels, right? Then the part of it is the geopolitics. It's the third reason why FDI moves to different countries. So geopolitics, we have an advantage because Sri Lanka is in a place where close to about 2.1 billion people come into from low income class to a middle income class, large consumption opportunity, and a country that can trade with three other or four other nations along with African countries. So there's geopolitically, we have a good opportunity. And then the important thing is for countries like us, Singapore, Sri Lanka, it's about the compelling investment climate or the compelling climate overall. It's not just the politics part of it, it's just every aspect of the factor cost, ease of doing business, market access, and all that comes into play. So that is what and how the FDI goes, the first question. The second part of it is that before what budget opens up what type of investors would come in this kind of a time frame, whether there's COVID or whether it's Sri Lanka's position right now. So there are two types. So one is either opportunistic investor or a long-term investor. These could be existing or new. The opportunistic guys comes in to look for a deal, distressed assets, opportunistic play. You have a little bit of tailwind in terms of the economic or the economy point of view. So they will come and quickly grab some assets and do it. Still good FDI. The second part is long-term play. So you look at 5, 10, 15-year horizons. You take a bet in terms of strategic location point of view, what the country has to offer, it's beyond political regimes or 4 or 5 year horizons, immediate crises of currency, which it is, you look at a long term and say, hey, this is a country that has great potential on these aspects. I'm going to invest for 5, 10 years, or 15 years, I'm going to do. So then the question is, what does the budget provide for those type of investors, existing or new? So firstly, it is, what's the stability do we provide? So I think that's a very important thing, and Professor, you rightly articulated. The important thing is the policy consistency on the macro and the micro point of view. So that stability is something that everyone, including the existing investors and the new investors, would look at. Because if they are going to come here, manufacture and export, those don't matter much because dollar import, dollar export, so they are net positive. But if you have exposure to the local market and whatnot, you need to have that stability statement. You need to make sure that the liberal policies remain such. That means meaning we've been open economy since 1978, making sure that the expatriation of profits available can be done. The currency and the capital can flow both ways. So those stability factors are important. Then the part of it is the direction. Now I don't think the budget is going to change the direction, but in the overall goal of the country where it is right now is to get the policies right for this country to double its GDP in 10 years. Now that is something fundamentally we need to do at this point, and the budget needs to reinforce, and I really look forward for that reinforcement. Because from 2014, 2015 onwards, 2020, we've been around the $79 to $85 billion chasm. We've been around $4,000 per capita GDP. Unless we get the right policy structures, and that is what is needed, and I think the speaker rightly said, certain foundations take time. But unless you do that foundation now, as a country, when it is at a crucial point around $4,000 per capita GDP, we're not going to come in out. So that's why the whole philosophy and the policy around the 10-year plan in terms of which sectors to focus on, how do you double the GDP, and then it's about getting those enabling factors in a budget. So it is not about throwing a quick bone in terms of tax or whichever it is, but getting the enable part of it right. Then I think the most important thing is, as you know, a budget is a framework statement in terms of what people work through in the year, in terms of getting things implemented in the month. So compelling investment climate and value proposition. So ensuring and remaining and retaining that value proposition is absolutely necessary. So in terms of minimum inconsistencies, I look forward in terms of the policy. We could argue multiple reasons for it, as Professor mentioned, but I think going forward, we need to have a better understanding, better clarity, better transparency, and a better consistency. And important thing is, we need to put that foundation for development. So we can look at and multiple ways to look at and say, look, how do you create that? Whether you do the ease of doing business in terms of creating more zones, getting investors to come in and invest, choosing 7 sectors that we have looked at. What are the specific ones to address? So we addressed pharmaceuticals and apparels last year. Why not about all the new minerals, new opportunities around the resources that we have, which we have not necessarily tapped, but it's a good time to tap. Graphene is really coming up, electronics coming up. How do we really leapfrog? Why don't we not start looking at electric cars? Because we won't have a component ecosystem of 3,000 components or more to build a traditional car, but you can do an electric car because the components are here, the materials here. Why not think through? We have an agenda of getting into more renewables. So there could be opportunities to look at producing renewable energy, reducing our energy bills, dependency on foreign fuels, but also developing a nascent industry because there's huge opportunity in terms of polycarbonate. So I would like to see, and I hope to see, and in terms of my policies and the way I look at it, is that cohesiveness in terms of the thrust, the development, and the supporting infrastructure, supporting industries to come in and provide the base in terms of the policies to be able to hold this up. So that's how I look at it. And if that happens, then of course FDI would be at the door.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sanjay Mohachala. That was him speaking on how Sri Lanka can attract more foreign direct investment into the country moving forward to the year 2022. My next question goes to Member of Parliament, Maitha Dissanayake. So I think this is something that keeps coming up every budget. Sri Lanka's debt to GDP ratio is over 100%, and it's quite concerning, if I may say. My simple question to you, sir, is does this mean Sri Lanka's debt is unsustainable? If so, how did we get here, and how can the 2022 budget implement proposals to direct Sri Lanka in the right trajectory of growth?
Thank you, and good evening to everybody, and thank you to the Foundation for hosting this together with NextGen. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and Satya, thank you very much for having us. I am not an economic expert. I am a very simple member of Parliament, but I do believe in the policy that country is first. So before we talk about the political angle and the economic and social factors in Sri Lanka, we must always think of country first. Saying that, I remember when I was very young, and my late father was also a member of Parliament, come budget time, the entire household is glued to the TV or the radio, listening to the Honorable Finance Minister's budget proposals, which in fact is the government's fiscal policy. So everything that we are looking at in terms of investment coming in, the fiscal policies that are going to be put in place, salaries to be risen or not, are government servants going to get their salary increment that they're expecting? Are the prices of cigarettes and alcohol going to go up? So we used to listen or watch on TV the finance minister's policy statement on behalf of the government on TV or radio. So looking at a budget, looking at foreign investment coming in, looking at how industries will be set up, will there be new industrial zones set up? For in all these things to work, we need political and economic stability in this country. So we are a very dynamic democratic country. We have been for the last 70 odd years. But when we look at our history, what have we really achieved in the past 70 years? We have been independent, we have been democratic. However, have the policies that we have adopted over the years worked for us? So, answering your question, I think, raises more questions. So in terms of a budget, in terms of fiscal policy, in terms of where we want to go as a country, certainly the COVID world pandemic has hit us very hard, but we in opposition believe that we can get out of this if the right policies are put in place, if we attract the direct foreign FDIs, if we set up industries correctly, and as the Honorable Chairman of the BOI stated, we need not just short-term policies, we need long-lasting, long-term policies. I think some of the countries, even India for that matter, are now looking at medium-term to long-term policies to fix their economies and get their countries moving. So we in Sri Lanka need, I always say this even in Parliament, we as parliamentarians, government and opposition need to work together. We need to fix this country first, because the way that we are going in terms of inflation, in terms of loss of FDI, people not wanting to invest in this country, we need to create that confidence in investors coming in and saying, look, Sri Lanka is good, trust us, invest in us. That's the kind of message we need to be sending out. But unfortunately, sometimes ad hoc policies do not help us in our medium to long-term goals.
Thank you very much, Mr. implementing the right policies and emerging out of the debt crisis we are in at the moment. My next question goes to Mr. Lenz, who is joining in with us all the way from Berlin. Thank you very much, sir, for being with us here today. So you spoke of the social market economy, and we all know this model upholds values of competition, freedom, private property, and the rule of law. This might be a rather broad question, but sir, my question to you is, how do you see this model fitting into Sri Lanka? And moving forward, how can we ensure, or how can the 2022 budget ensure that these values are incorporated moving forward to year 2022 and even forward 2023 and 2024?
Well, thank you very much for the question. I'm very happy to be with you, at least virtually. To be honest, the weather in Berlin is very cold and stormy, so I guess it would have been very nice to join you in person. But anyway, maybe that will be possible in some month, at least next year after we all overcome the pandemic. So, well, regarding the question, first of all, I have to stress that there's really no one-size-fits-it-all for implementing a free market order. So, for example, if you compare Germany, Switzerland, and Austria, three very similar countries, they all made different choices regarding aspects, I don't know, for example, organizing healthcare or how the tax system is working. So basically, every country has to find its own way. I mean, we could also look at, to compare Germany, for example, to the US. Both basically are free market societies, but we choose very different paths to organize that. So every country has to find its own way. But I do think that every country on the world can profit from implementing a free market order, such as the social market economy. And well, regarding the budget, first of all, I guess good. I read about the debt problem. I heard you talk about it, and I think first good message is that a lot of good policies are not expensive. So we already talked about the importance of a long-term perspective, for example. So a long-term commitment to political stability and to implementing free market reforms, that is not expensive. You do not need a lot of money to do that, but you do need political commitment. You also do not need money for looking at bureaucracy. Are there rules? Well, I'm sure there are rules. In Germany, there certainly are, but I'm sure there also are in Sri Lanka that hinder entrepreneurs from Sri Lanka, but also that may hinder foreign direct investments. So changing these rules is just a question of political will. Well, and when looking at the budget, one idea, of course, is the justice system well funded, because when you look at political stability, at the promise for investors and entrepreneurs that their rights will be respected, the rule of law is really key for economic development. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lenz. I'd like to pose my next question to Mr. Sanjay Mohtal again. So according to the Ministry of Finance annual report for the year 2020, it stated that foreign direct investment fell by 42.2%. We also know that for many years, Sri Lanka's foreign direct investments have only reached a maximum of $1 billion US. According to World Bank data, this, as a percentage of GDP, this was only about 0.9% in the year 2019. So my question to you is, what does this mean for the year 2022 simply, and how can, most importantly, Sri Lanka make our market environment, our labor force, our legal and regulatory framework, and other enabling factors attractive to investors moving forward to the year 2022?
Good question, Satya. I think if you look at the history, we have top 2 billion on certain years. On average, I think it's around 1 billion to 1.5 billion. Now, if you look at a country like India, it's 67 times bigger than us. So they get about $70 billion of FDI to feed 1.3 billion. So it's not the FDI is the only panacea, and I think we have looked at FDI and say like, okay, that's a mechanism to fill a budget gap. But I think what matters is the quality of FDI and what are we getting these FDI into the country. Because we have the wrong misconception that if every single FDI is the same. Let's make you an example. So as we become wealthier and become more upward mobile and congregate into cities, we need nice apartments. Yes, you do get FDIs to build nice apartments. But that also money comes in, and most of the raw material and the fittings and all that, the money goes out for that. And somebody will buy that apartment, and maybe the investor is a foreign investor would take it. I'm not just saying to discourage, but I'm saying to get you to get the feel of what is the economic multiplier an FDI creates. And I think that is where our focus should be, not really the dollar value. The second part of it, say you put up a rubber factory, another tire factory. So that demands a massive amount of natural rubber from Sri Lanka. So you have two options. Either you could encourage people to grow rubber, increase their yield. We are about 700 kilos a hectare, whereas the top, estates in Indonesia and Thailand would get about 1,400. Some of the great estates in Monoragal would get about 2,000. Now just imagine the amount of dollars that flow down to the farmer who has the land, who cultivates the tapper, one who makes the rubber sheets, the one who transmits. So there's much more value creation, lot more multiply effect, you call it as an economist, that retains in the country. Similarly, if you want to get 100 million exports, you need to get $100 million worth of FDI for a rubber factory, give or take. That's a kind of rough number. But then again, as a country, we are also in a transition. We are moving from a factor-driven to a knowledge-driven economy. But for example, there was a company who came in and recruited almost 1,000 people, school leavers from O-levels and A-levels, and their capital formation was only at $10 million. But these are high-paying jobs. If you are an IT graduate, if you learn IT the first time, if you come and start coding from the beginning, and if you're 10 years down the line, you might be working not in Sri Lanka, maybe Microsoft back in Seattle. But that is the upward mobile workforce that we're going to create. So what we really need is, while the FDI numbers matter, to make sure that we get the right investment so that it creates the workforce, it creates the infrastructure, it creates the ecosystem that helps this country go. Because otherwise what will happen is we will be running about the FDI numbers. 2014, 2013 up to 2018 will be at the same flat rate. Because someone working and getting 150,000 rupees or 250,000 rupees as a coder, right? If you look at their salary component, it will be 10 to 15 million if it's 1,000 people. And for that same amount, if it's a manufacturing job, your labor component will be about 10%. You need to get $100 million worth of exports, just manufacturing exports. You need to get $100 million worth of FDI. But I got the same outcome for the country in 1/10. So I think the holistically what you look at is not just the FDI number, but it's the kind of the FDI that comes in, what is the multiply effect that creates, how does that lay foundation for the growth point of view. Now you asked the pertinent question about what would the budget, the policy definition would work for several things around legal, labor, and in terms of enabling factors. I think if most of you would have probably tuned into Sri Lanka Investor Forum, which we did back in May, and one of the things that outlined was about ease of doing business. So legal framework and legal reform is something that has been ongoing, right? So it starts from creating capacity in the legal system. That means getting the right judges, or the number of judges, the benches, the infrastructure in terms of the courtrooms being done. So that is just debottlenecking. Secondly, it's about the digitization of the legal system. Thirdly, you need to get the acts and the regulation and the law to make sure that certain issues, when it happens, it doesn't drag for 10 years, but it gets resolved very quickly. So one of the things that the Honorable Justice Minister and we are working in is to have a set of courts top down so that addresses all regulatory related issues. Port City is working in terms of getting a arbitration seat here. So there are multiple aspects of it that goes in, and I think what we expect or what we look for in the budget is to make, how do we accelerate some of these things, right? So that's important. On the labor, absolutely most important thing, because typically globally it's about 51% labor participation when it comes to women in the economy. We are roughly at about 35%, right? So one of those reasons that when we pushed our fabric zone into Eravur is to take industries to the east. We have been out of our conflict for a long time, but we haven't really taken the industries in a mass scale there, right? We need to make sure that people are employed in their vicinity, not make migratory labor, right? So they can tend to their fields once they're done with the work, they can be with their families. So the ecosystem develops, the money stays there, not in a boarding house being spent there, but the money stays in the locality. That the development happens in the locality. So tourism is a great example, right? But the problem what we have is an expensive product because our factor costs are expensive. But we need to look at and see how coming out of this pandemic, the revenge travel is going to be there, right? So if you look at, we are getting almost 6,000 tourists every 3 days, or 2 days. So that's about 3,000 a day. So which is good. So but we need to make sure that tourism sector is propped up. So giving relief, which has been very badly hit, and also enabling those industries to regenerate, recoup, and also step up. And I think that's most important. And the last one you asked me was about the enabling factors. I think the most enabling factors, what I look for is what Professor mentioned, the deregularization. So there's been a committee being appointed, there have been some policies being talked about, there's a judiciary committee for customs. So I would like to see the recommendations being pushed and pushed in an aggressive way. Because as the Honorable Speaker talked about, the foundation, when you act today, it's not a magic wand. It's not, you're not going to see the fruits tomorrow. It's 3, 4, 5 years, or maybe it's longer. But we got to get it started quickly because it's like a snowball, right? So if you get the right momentum, it only gathers and it becomes bigger. So we need to now get out of the pandemic mindset and say, look, okay, how do I catch up the 2 years that I lost in terms of getting to our objective of doubling our GDP? What are the things that really matters in terms of moving the needle within the budgetary and the fiscal discipline that we need to have, and in the room that we have in terms of making, we don't have a country in terms of throwing in helicopter money. The planning that and executing well, timely, and in a decisive manner. So that's what I look for in terms of policy.
Thank you very much, sir. That was Mr. Sanjay Mohtal on how to create the right ecosystem to attract foreign direct investment to Sri Lanka. My next question goes to Professor Sirimala Beratna. So this is once again a rather broad question. We all know Sri Lanka is faced with a severe debt crisis, a foreign exchange crisis, and on top of that, we have had to face challenges brought forward by the COVID-19 pandemic. So there are multiple challenges that the upcoming 2022 budget indeed has to address, and I think the general public is also expecting these issues to be addressed in the upcoming budget in one way or the other. So in your opinion, how do you think the upcoming budget can even attempt to unravel these many issues, if I may ask you?
It's a peculiar question to everybody, I guess. And from the larger segment of the society, as you rightly mentioned, they are expecting a big relief from the budget. But obviously the budget cannot provide relief without somebody's out there to finance it. So let me elaborate the point that that why it is difficult right now. Because of the when we look at our budgetary management, it has been in a very shaky situation for not due to pandemic, but long years, and it has been there. Now, if you look at right now, you would see the expenditure is double the government revenue, so which means about half of the expenditure is counted as budget deficit, right? And then if you look at, again related to the debt issue that you were talking about 70% of government revenue goes away as debt service payments annually. So in this kind of setup, what kind of budget that you expect? Number one issue is budget is just a short-term policy plan, just for 1 year, 12-month period of time. And it has to be consistent with the long-term plan, long-term policy agenda, showing, okay, this is our direction and this is where we are moving, and showing it to consumers, showing it to investors, and showing it to international community and all these multilateral, bilateral associations that we are dealing with. We have to show the direction, and then in that context, then you present the budgets annually which are consistent with your long-term plan. Okay? But we don't see that kind of consistency at the moment. But as Mr. Sanjay mentioned, there are moments, there are moves taking place. Okay, we want to have a long-term plan, and in this way the country should go in this direction. But because of this particular budgetary problem that we have been nurturing for years, and then finally the country was, well, that was financed by borrowing. So that's one of the reasons why the debt problem is so high now. Now, this year, during the period of this pandemic issue, the budget, given the narrow fiscal space, the budget problem multiplied because the government lost the revenue, and the government has to spend more money to take care of the pandemic issues as well as those sections that have been affected by the COVID pandemic issue. So how did the country manage this? Because particularly through printing money, and the central bank supplied the amount of money that the budget, the treasury needed to manage these things. In fact, it is not only Sri Lanka, all over it is the case, because in a crisis situation, in a recession period, you see that the link between money and inflation is broken down. So that link becomes weaker, giving space for many countries to increase money supply, print more money. So that's why you see even in the West, in the USA, in these countries, even China, they have been printing so much money, but no inflation in the world. So it is as same as here in this small country, Sri Lanka. So we had the space to print money and to finance the budget deficit during the COVID time. But the problem comes now because the vaccine administration has been around 60-70% been vaccinated in the world now with both vaccines, both doses. In Sri Lanka also, I think it is a very successful case compared to many other developing countries. I believe now more than half of our population has been vaccinated with both doses. So that's a successful case among developing countries. So with this thing, what would you expect? As a side effect of the vaccine program, you would see now the inflation is coming up and the aggregate demand is getting heated in the world as well as in Sri Lanka, limiting the central bank's ability to finance those budget deficits. Now it is compelled, the central bank is compelled to look at its primary objective, which is actually the price stability. So which means now the budget is in a quite difficult situation, how to manage these things. Now my last part of that answer is, because we are now looking at these short-term solutions for a long-term problem, and I always say that, because our problem has not been the pandemic issue. It has been pre-pandemic, also it has been non-pandemic even during the pandemic period. So there are multiple things, fundamental things that we need to address, so that economic recovery means not the budget, economic recovery means not ending the pandemic, economic recovery means for Sri Lanka, unlike many other countries in our neighborhood, it is even going beyond pre-pandemic situation, because pre-pandemic situation is actually a downturn, and we have seen that downturn for many years, and finally it was hit by the pandemic. So in that setup, I think even the budgetary management has quite a lot to do, not within this short-term 12-month budget, but managing the expenditure, cutting down wasteful expenditure, and also targeting how to improve the revenue side, because revenue side has been a real problem. You can see that our 80% of our tax revenue comes from commodity taxes, about 20-25% maximum. It has been from direct taxes, which is actually a sign of an underdeveloped country, not a middle income country. If you have low direct tax income. Why? Because the government doesn't know people's income and people's wealth. So it is easy to catch them when they spend money. So that has been our practice for quite a long time. I think we need to improve the tax collection efficiency. So these long-term issues have to be addressed to come to a sound budgetary management, at least within the next couple of years.
Thank you very much, Professor Sirimala Beratna. I know I threw a very broad question at you and you gave us a very comprehensive answer. So you touched upon government revenue, and Member of Parliament Maitha Dissanayake, my next question to you is on government expenditure. They go hand in hand. So every year when the budget is around the corner, I think government expenditure and losses made by state-owned enterprises is something that comes up every year. We all know that Sri Lanka's recurrent expenditure, our highest payment is on interest payments. It's about 36%, and the second is about 30%, which is salaries and wages. So, sir, my question to you is, do you think the upcoming budget should reprioritize our government expenditure? And how can this be done while ensuring the welfare of the general public?
Thank you. It's another very good question. State-owned enterprises is a huge burden on our country's economy. My personal thinking is, of course, that government should not be involved in state-owned enterprises, running businesses. Government should set up businesses, have public-private partnerships, and let business experts run the business. Government is not. Government should not be in the business of running business. In a country like ours, where the budget deficits are huge, we are borrowing every year, and the inflation rates are going up. As the professor rightly said, government is printing money, but again, it's on a short-term basis. When we look at repayments, and when we look at trying to finance our borrowings, we need to look at, I think, as my friend and the chairman of the BOI said, look at long-term investments coming into the country. So government expenditure is something that we need to really look at. And looking at state-owned enterprises, we may want to look at something like the Singaporean model of Temasek, and how to regulate. And also in terms of restructuring our economy, we have put it out in Parliament as well in looking at organizations like the IMF, because we have to find a balance between that welfare state and providing for the people, those who really need the financial assistance, but also at the same time, nowadays I'm actually studying as a case in point, Greece, for example, how it has come up in the last so many years, the last 10 years, out of a very, very bad economic problem. So in the last so many years, Greece has actually taken advice from organizations like the IMF, and really worked at developing their economies. So we need to look at a lot of our loss-making state-owned enterprises. One of the things that I do want to mention here is, especially in terms of the Sri Lankan Airlines, as an example, Honorable Kabir Hashim and Honorable Eran Wickramaratne in 2017 and in 2018 made a report and observations, and that was also presented to Parliament, in terms of restructuring our state-owned enterprises and how to create employment. Some state-owned enterprises we will have to retrench. We will have to get the public-private partnerships going. I'm not saying or advocating selling of our assets here, but I'm simply saying that we need to think anew and maybe think out of the box in terms of economic strategies and reforms that we need to make. One thing that a charge that does come for us, especially in opposition, is that the opposition parties in Parliament especially oppose everything and anything that the government puts forward in terms of our development strategy. This is not entirely true. We have always maintained that whatever proposals that the government make in terms of social welfare as well as economic development, we will support. Especially during the pandemic era, we actually told in Parliament that we will support the government expenditure in terms of relief for the pandemic, especially getting down the vaccines. As Professor said, I think it's a couple of weeks ago, we were at about 53-55% in terms of both doses being vaccinated. So we need to strike this balance in terms of our economic progress and where we want to be. One of the things, of course, in terms of our, when we look at the economic future of this country, we need to have democracy, accountability, efficiency, and of course, effectiveness. One of the things that I've been advocating in Parliament for the last so many years is a system of monitoring and evaluation. In Parliament, it has to be set up. One of the faults of this government in terms of looking at our financial system is actually to get rid of the National Audit Commission. Again, one of the things that I really want to see in Parliament re-established again is the sectoral oversight committees. Now we have been in Parliament, this Parliament, for over a year, but the sectoral oversight committee system has not been re-implemented. The standing orders, that certain section has been suspended. So we need to look at our budgetary cost, how much money, I mean, we are earning about 4 billion rupees a day, but we are spending something like 14 billion rupees a day. Then the other part of the question is certainly, again, it raises more questions than answers. Something I was discussing with you as I came in. When we look at our brain drain scenario in this country right now, lots of our youngsters are actually leaving. I have friends who wanted letters of recommendation. I don't know if it's a good thing getting a letter of recommendation from politicians these days, but they are leaving this country even after the war. We had a war in this country and many of our political leaders were assassinated, including my father. But those people who had businesses stayed on. They did not leave this country. But now we are finding a situation where the youngsters are leaving. I think I read one of your reviews and articles recently where a lot of the youngsters are leaving. So we are facing a brain drain scenario. We are having an issue where people are selling their business and their assets and want to go overseas. So in this scenario, how do we look after our country's poor? How do we look after our people's welfare? How do we manage our country's economy and strike a balance between? Certainly, having ad hoc policies does not help us. This is where I agree with our BOI chairman. We need to look at a long-term, medium-term strategy in terms of attracting FDIs to our country. And there, as he correctly says, there are different types of FDIs. So in this scenario, where do we start? We are going to face a huge problem with our agriculture sector very soon, including the tea industry. Come December, we will not have the kind of fertilizer that we do require. This idea of organic farming was actually rooted during our government time, but we made a conscious decision saying that we need to look at a longer term strategy in terms of organic farming.
Thank you, Member of Parliament.
Sorry,
If I may
no.
interrupt, I'm really sorry. We would love to hear your thoughts, but given time constraints, we might have to move forward. I think you also touched upon this fact of young people leaving the country. It's definitely not a good indication, and I think it's even more so why we need to get this 2022 budget right. So moving forward, my next question goes to Mr. Lenz. I think Member of Parliament also touched on this topic quite broadly. So how do you think Sri Lanka can ensure the welfare of poorer segments of society through effective social safety nets while also ensuring macroeconomic stability?
That is a question. Thank you very much for whole conferences, of course. But let me just give you two ideas. So first of all, I think that really the most important social policy is prosperity. And that is something that a lot of people forget in the discussion. So if society as a whole is prosperous, a lot of people make money on their own, and there are also resources to spend on poorer people. And also free markets are part or are a very good social instrument in themselves, because they are really the best instrument to provide good quality, cheap foods and other goods. Yeah, so I would say that moving to free markets and to tap into the power of entrepreneurs is really the first step for any social policy. But of course, and that is maybe a difference between the social market economy and the market order that I don't know, for example, the US implemented. In the social market economy, there's a strong focus also on social policy. And I guess there are two very good cases. Well, first of all, social policies as a safety net are very good for the acceptance of a free market economy. But also they can help to buffer negative consequences, because especially if you start to implement free market reforms, there will be people who lose. Society as a whole will profit, but there will always be people who lost. For example, if you break up a closed market, the people who earned their money in this closed market may be on the losing side. So social policies are very important. But yeah, to tell the truth, we have to keep efficiency in mind. That is, to be honest, a problem in Germany. We had 10 very good years, as I said in my talk. So good years are always bad in terms that people start to grow overconfident. So keep efficiency in mind, and also the financial stability. Don't spend too much. Be very careful what to promise, and try to focus the help on people who really need it. So these are just some general ideas. I'm really no expert in the Sri Lankan social welfare system, so I can just stay on these general ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. My next question goes to Mr. Sanjay Mohotala. So I think throughout this discussion, panelists have been speaking about government revenue and expenditure. I think over the years, Sri Lanka has built a reputation for giving very generous tax concessions. My question to you, sir, is this something that we can afford to do going forward to the year 2022 in terms of the budget?
Sometimes all reputations are hard to shrug off, but I don't think that's the case if you look at the last couple of years. Look, I think at the end of the day, if I can probably reflect on some of the comments that was discussed here as well. Tax is a mechanism, it's a tool, it's not the only tool, and it is not the most important tool either. But when I talked about in the beginning type of FDI that comes in, the velocity related, market related, and competitive investment climate related, tax is an equalizer to make sure that we have a level playing field with all the others. Because today the business can be structured in multiple ways. You can have a tolling operation in Sri Lanka. So even if I have a tax regime to tax the profit of a company, if it's a tolling operation, you have nothing much to tax. You can have an IT company and the billing can happen in Ireland, so you be paid for the salaries. So what are we taxing? So what we need, as Professor mentioned, is the smart taxes. Because at the end of the day, as the economy expands, we have to keep abreast in terms of our tax collection, which we have not done. And I think, look, that's the truth. We cannot continue to do that. But is that the time that we go completely backwards? I'm not sure. What is the time frame for us to get back? But we have to be very cognizant about it. And the other fundamental problem is, as my honorable colleague also mentioned, whether it's a government sector or whichever it is, unless we expand the pie, we are looking at a small slice of it and trying to slice it multiple ways. I do agree, and you talked about brain drain. I've been out for more than 15, 16 years. I gave up career and I came here because this is the time to help the country. The important thing what I'm trying to bring is that I was in Singapore where the taxes are very transparent and very little tax filing is as 5-minute exercise. But that is when you expand the pie. So for the expand in the pie means you're growing the GDP, you're growing, right? And the government sector is an apparatus. But the government sector has to play a part in making sure it's efficient and it's not dragging it down. And I think the problem in most of the government sector, and this is what my feel is, having worked across almost close to 30 countries, is the policymakers and the people who are hindering or doesn't want to change, or the unions are ones who are going to retire in a couple of years. But the younger generation in that particular organization is one who's going to inherit it. But that is where the disconnect in a country is there. That is where in a disconnect, maybe some of the foreign people are leaving. That is where in a country where you need to make sure that, you know, the policies are inclusive to make sure that the growth happens with the right people, growth happens while creating the right opportunities for the younger and the youth and everyone to be employed. So for me, coming back, tax is only one mechanism, right? So I think the most important thing is we continue to use tax as a tool. Now, for example, we are putting a lot of effort to grow pharmaceuticals. So if you look at, the company could have an option, either go to Singapore, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, why not? So we need to make sure their cost of setting up in Sri Lanka is equalized. And it's an industry which is not here. We need to make sure that the best climate is created for them to choose a good. So if you are coming and putting a sewing factory in Sri Lanka, do I need to give a tax break? Perhaps not. ICT, I would say why not? Because you tax personal income, not necessarily corporate, because how you structure the businesses, but rather if you employ a lot of people, it actually has social benefit, and hopefully the next time when we talk, where more youth will be probably staying back in the country because we can retain more people, because it is an upward mobile kind of like a industry. So we need to then also look at and say, all right, if not tax, what do we address? So we need to make sure equitable taxation is there in this country, right? And I think the thing is, we are very resourceful in terms of even if it's COVID, if you say don't travel, you'll figure out a way to travel, right? We are very resourceful in terms of sometimes doing things or absconding or working around things. But I think most importantly, what we need to is to make sure that we do play our role as citizens and use these tools in a sparring but in the most effective way in terms of getting the country going. So in policy point of view, I would expect more labor participation. I would expect some clear and needed decisions on certain government institutions, because at the end of the day, efficiency is the name of the game. Either you are with it or without, because at the end of the day, it's the country and the citizens, the political establishments that support or survive to take the country and the citizens' will. You have the establishments, government or private or whichever it is, to be able to deliver that on that. Then you have the employees of that organization, no one, right, who to deliver that. And then you have the unions and whatnot in that organization in order. So if the, and which my colleague parliamentary also agreed, the country is the most paramount thing to do, everything should fall in line. And to deliver on the country's view, the apparatus has to be chosen, apparatus has to be picked, apparatus has to be used, tax, government organizations, reforms, all that is part and parcel of it. So that's how I would look at in a country point of view. And this is my motto when I was in a school, it was country before self. If that is the case, and that should be a motto for everyone, that is when we come out of a situation like this, and that's when we come out of a situation holistically as a society. And that's what I would also like to see in the policy, in the budget point of view. How do we holistically come out, making sure that the poor is uplifted, not always fed. There's a saying, right? If you give fish, he'll be full for the day, but if you teach him how to catch fish, he'll be fed for the rest of their life. So that is what I think is needed, and that is what needs to be supported in a budget, in a crisis like this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sanjay Mohantala. That was very, enlightening. Professor Sirimala Aberatna, my question to you is, import substitution has, as we all know, has been a very popular policy stance. While there are many other items, I think importation of vehicles have been restricted for more than a year now, and we all know it's a big part of the Sri Lankan dream, right? To be able to buy a vehicle, own a vehicle, I think that's something Sri Lankans value a lot. So moving forward, how do you see this, or how do you think this would play out in the year 2022 in terms of import restrictions? Do you think that's a policy that should be taken forward to a new year as well?
One of my colleagues was very fond of import controls and producing or assembling vehicles domestically. But last year he was looking for a vehicle to be purchased and no new vehicles available, and then he was looking for at least a second-hand one, and he was looking for a particular Japanese brand. So I asked him, why don't you look for the locally assembled one? So this is for other people, but not for myself. So I don't mind actually, because many countries, they have implemented these kind of policies here and they are looking for pet projects, and we need to give protection here, and we need to nurture Hyundai in South Korea or Proton in Malaysia, and somehow some industries were successful like Hyundai and they can compete in the world market. But some were not successful like Proton, they still need government support to survive. And in fact, you don't find the failure cases also in the world because they are not recorded. What is recorded in our literature also, the success cases. So you quote all those successful cases like Hyundai or POSCO or anything else, and that have been, that had grown to become world leaders in those areas, and then you try to make it a doctrine and policy doctrine. Okay, this is the way to go forward. No, it is not the way to go forward. You can choose those here and there, those projects, and every government, every country, I have seen some of those things, and as I said, some were successful, some were not. But what is more important is the overall economic policy, the overall conducive environment that enable all businessmen to flourish and nurture their businesses. That's what we need. So without damaging that one, personally I don't mind selecting this kind of pet projects for certain people, they like it, but it's not the way to nurture them also by controlling the imports. Because now if you are talking about the social market economy, as Justus mentioned there, you are controlling the market now. You restrict the access to the market and then try to intervene in the domestic market, promoting something else. You have series of other problems why domestic industries are not growing, series of other problems, and you put all of them under the carpet and you look at only the import control as the easy way out. It's not the way. You keep imports coming in. If you want to support a particular industry, particular business, you support with other things, and there are many other areas where government has to intervene. Our regulatory mechanism, how many signatures you need. Mr. Sanjay might know, when foreign investor comes, how many documents that he has to carry, how many times he has to meet you and other public sector bureaucratic the officers and all these things. And the infrastructure, the electricity bill, and in all these areas there are a lot of things that the government can intervene and support the businesses selectively, but not overall import controls. And we have a long experience that it has never been successful. I hope at least some of you remember from 1960s until 1977, how we have tightened our import controls and ended up with a disastrous situation there. In fact, I admire that government because they prepared this country for policy reforms. And that's why very easily we were able to change the policies overnight in 1977. But I regret about what happened after that, because we did not carry those reforms forward.
Thank you very much, Professor Sirimala Beratna. My next question goes to Member of Parliament Mayanthi Dissanayake. The government revenue, as we have been speaking throughout, has been quite an issue in Sri Lanka for a very long period of time. I think in the 1990s it was about 21% of GDP. However, in 2020 it plummeted to 8%. My question to you, sir, is this something the 2022 budget can address, given how burdened the general public already is with price hikes and etc.?
My sincere hope is that this budget is not going to be a election budget. What I mean by that is, generally what happens is, before any provincial council or any other election year comes up, the government will tend to try to win the hearts and minds of the people and give what I call a election budget, where the goodies are given. But to answer your question, I sincerely hope that we do implement some of the policies that have been discussed even in this forum. And as I said earlier, I hope it's a policy document where we are looking at a policy statement where we are looking at the poorer people in this country, and we are talking about an economic and social net to look after them. So I sincerely hope that we are able to move in that direction, get the investment that we require. Again, I would like to reflect very briefly on, as the professor said, in 1977-78, this country's economy was opened up, and one of the things were they had a very small cabinet in terms of, in today's terms, cabinet of only 24 ministers at the time. I saw somewhere, I think it's Verite, where they propose a cabinet of about 15 members. So I think with this budget, I hope that we are able to get the country going in terms of our economic development, like in 77 to 78. Young, dynamic leadership is required in this country in terms of looking at the bigger picture. So I sincerely hope, I hope springs eternal, I think. I do not have an answer to your question in that sense, but I live in hope that we are able to look at this budget in a positive light, and the government policies, not just short term, but in terms of medium and long term, will be focused on this.
Thank you very much, Member of Parliament. I think we've come to the very end of our panel discussion. My final question goes to Mr. Lenz. So you spoke of Germany's summer of 1948 in your opening remarks. In this hour of crisis in Sri Lanka, what lessons do you think Sri Lanka can extract from that period from Germany?
Well, that is a very good last question. Thank you very much. To be honest, I will not focus on certain policies or you have to do this or that, but I guess the real important lesson is that you have to stay optimistic, and that there really is the possibility to develop even out of a dire situation. 1948, the situation here was horrible, quite frankly, and it is remarkable when we look back that there was enough political will to say we will start the reform process. We will not try to manage misery, but we will look into the future. We will be optimistic. We also will give our reforms the necessary time until they start to work. As I said at that time, there was no consensus in society that is really the best way. So there was always the option to start a planned economy, and there were many people who believed that would be more successful. Well, I talked about the results. So really stay optimistic. Try to get a long-term consensus that going into free markets, into freedom, that is the right direction, and well, then stay on course. And of course, we talked about social policies. You do have to try to make the way as easy as possible, and also to see that there will also always be people who lose in the process, and you have to take care of that as well. Yeah. So be optimistic, especially after the corona pandemic.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lenz, for those very positive ending remarks. I think we've come to the conclusion of our discussion today. The topic for today was Sri Lanka's paths to economic stability. We had Professor Sirimala Beratna with us, Mr. Sanjay Mohotala, Member of Parliament Mahintha Disanayaka, and Mr. Lenz. Thank you everyone for being here today. I hope this discussion gave you some insight into what to be expected from the 2022 budget. I think the general public is also expecting many of our macroeconomic challenges to be addressed in this upcoming budget. Thank you very much. We hope to see you again.
Thank you very much to Satya, our moderator, and also to each of our panelists. We request our panelists to now take their seats in the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, I do hope you agree that our panelists for our discussion have indeed helped to educate us with their thought-provoking remarks as they suggested their perspectives on meaningful reforms with regard to our national budget. Now, as we're almost drawing to the end of our event, ladies and gentlemen, let's remember that this event has been an endeavor that has come together thanks to the effort and energy of many contributors. So we'd now like to take a few moments to thank each of these special individuals and organizations and offer them our deep gratitude for their invaluable aid and assistance. To now officially sum up our appreciation in a formal vote of thanks, please join me in welcoming the co-convener of Next Gen SL. Let's put our hands together for Rasika Jayakodi.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As you all know, in Sri Lanka, once in every 5 years, the government is replaced by the opposition. And in keeping with that tradition, I'm replacing my work, so he asked me to speak on behalf of him. First of all, I would like to thank our keynote speaker, Mr. Eustace Lenz, the policy advisor for economic affairs at the Liberal Institute affiliated with FNF, for his valuable insights. There's a lot we can learn from Germany. And our panelists, Professor Ilimar Aberatna, MP Mahata Disanayaka, Mr. Sanjay Mohottala, Chairman BOI, and our moderator Satya, and again Eustace for his valuable inputs on Sri Lanka ahead of the budget, which is coming at a very critical time for the country. And I also thank the members of the press who came here. This is the first event of this sort, I think, after the reopening of the country, so it is very important that we get this going. So thank you very much for coming here. And members of the diplomatic community, you've been a great source of support for us. Thank you very much for your support. And other distinguished guests who have come here tonight, you've been a great audience. Thank you very much for that. And I would like to thank our partner in putting this together, FNF. I mean, we started having this discussion a couple of weeks ago, and then we realized that there's an urgent need for reforms, and there's an urgent need for a discussion, a fruitful discussion on reforms that should be engineered by the upcoming budget. So in that context, we would like to express our sincere gratitude to FNF Sri Lanka for their valuable work that they're doing here. And thank you very much. You've been a great audience, and enjoy the rest of the night. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rasika, for those warm words of gratitude expressed. Ladies and gentlemen, as we almost come to the end of this event, we trust that today's conversation has provided all of us immense understanding so that we can understand the powerful potential of the national budget. And here's hoping and trusting that Budget 2022 will attempt to position our country and economy for a sustainable and inclusive growth, bringing with it a better life for Sri Lankans. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we now draw the curtains on our discussion here today on Budget 2022, organized for you by NextGen SL in partnership with the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom. It's now our pleasure to invite you to join us for dinner and fellowship, of course, in keeping with the prevailing health and safety precautions. So on that note, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your participation here, and I wish you a pleasant evening ahead. Thank you and have a nice day.